Hey y'all, this is Darren Van Dam, and you are watching Flick Connection, the show that connects you with the best movies to stream. And today we're talking about 20 of the absolute best movies you can currently catch included with Prime Video. So I'm always first to admit that Prime Video not only has a terrible user interface, occasionally though, they do add a heap of good flicks, and just here at the beginning of November, they added a bunch of really great movies, including a couple of bangers at the end of October. So we're gonna go through a list of 20 movies currently included with Prime Video, spending about a minute per movie. This video is sponsored by AG1 by Athletic Greens, but I'll be telling you more about them later in the video. Right now, we're gonna get this list kicked off with 5 action movies, and then we'll mix things up a bit. But my number 20 pick on this list is actually HITMAN. Now this is based on a very popular game series, and I have played the games. I will admit though, the movie did not really excite lovers of the games, but that's good news for you because this is actually kind of a cool action flick, even if it doesn't really represent the original video game that well. And it's Timothy Olyphant before he was as big of a star as he is today, so it's kind of cool to see him running around shooting people up with a bald head and a barcode on the back of his neck. This is my number 20 pick though. This is not a great story or anything like that, but it's a pretty stylish action movie. I will say there is a rated R version and an unrated version. The unrated version just has like 2 minutes of extra footage. It's not really worth watching. However, my number 2 pick on this list also has 2 versions that are wildly different from each other. My next pick is sort of an action thriller that actually stars Johnny Depp before he was huge. He was pretty big when this came out, but not nearly as big as he would become. Christopher Walken also stars in Nick of Time. Now, it's a little cheesy, but Johnny Depp plays a guy named Nick in this movie, and this revolves around a political assassination that he's trying to be forced into, and it all takes place in one building over the course of one day, really over the course of just a few hours, so it almost feels like it's happening in real time, which keeps things moving and keeps it pretty fast-paced. You've either got Johnny Depp or Christopher Walken on camera in almost every shot of this movie, and they both make this work really well. Don't get me wrong, there's a good supporting cast, but those two guys duking it out, whether it be verbally or physically in this movie, is really fun to watch, and this is just a good gem of a thriller that bounces around on different streaming services. My next pick stars Mark Wahlberg and was just recently on Netflix. It has been removed and moved to Prime Video, but I consider Contraband to be one of his more underrated movies from the past 10 years. It's a little boilerplate, which is why it's back at number 18, but it's also kind of surprisingly fast-paced once it picks up. He plays a smuggler in this movie, doing kind of one last job. You've heard that before. You've seen it in dozens of movies. And Contraband, story-wise, while there are some twists and turns that are surprising, again, it's pretty basic, but some of the action that unfolds is surprisingly fast-paced with a lot of twists and turns in the action sequences. While there are some silly elements to Contraband, there's also some really grounded elements that make this feel fairly realistic, even if they do overreach a few times. You've also got a fantastic role from Ben Foster in this movie. So if you haven't ever seen it, it's definitely one of Mark Wahlberg's better efforts, again, in the last 10 years or so. Okay, my next pick is actually rated PG, so it is family friendly. However, I'm not really recommending this as a family movie. Sky Captain in the World of Tomorrow not only features a packed cast with Jude Law, Angelina Jolie, Gwyneth Paltrow, as well as some other great actors like Giovanni Ribisi, and they're all playing in this retro sci-fi movie with all this Art Deco style and everything. It's really a fun watch, but also this was the first movie really done this way, or at least the first big budget movie done where all of the backgrounds and everything are completely CGI or animated. Now, it's very obvious in this movie, and it's kind of the style of it, and Sky Captain makes it work. It's actually a really cool delivery device for this kind of campy vintage story. But this style of movie making is almost exclusively how they make big budget projects today. All of the backgrounds and all of the Marvel movies are all completely computer generated, and while they look a lot more convincing today, This was the precursor to the way a lot of those types of movies are made today, and it also happens to be a really fun watch. Okay, now maybe the last true action movie on this particular list is also a new release and one of the most fast-paced action movies to have been released this year so far. I'm talking about Michael Bay's Ambulance. So this is one of the newest movies currently included with Prime Video. And say what you will about Michael Bay movies, but his style of action does work sometimes. He has made some bangers over the years. Movies like The Rock, Bad Boys 2 is an excellent over-the-top action movie, and Ambulance fits right in with those movies. The only real difference here is there is less of a story. This is a heist gone wrong, and the entire movie is the heist and the chase that would follow. The twist, if there is one, is that they're trying to escape in an ambulance. There's someone who needs medical care in the back of the ambulance. So this movie does mix up the genre quite a bit. You also get Jake Gyllenhaal playing a villain, which he doesn't do often, but when he does a real superb job at it. I actually love what he did with this movie. It's Michael Bay. The camera never stops moving. It can be very dizzying, and some of his movies even just put me to sleep, but not Ambulance. This one is full throttle, R-rated, tons of fun to watch, and you do not have to have your brain switched on all the way to enjoy this one, which is kind of the fun of it. Okay, my next pick is also a new release. It is a 2022 theatrical release that might make it into my top 10 movies of 2022. However, I'm not quite sure how I feel about The Northman yet. This is the latest film from writer-director Robert Eggers. He's most famous for The Witch and The Lighthouse, this being his most accessible movie by far, meaning it's the least weird, it's the least off-putting. However, there's still quite a bit of weird and off-putting things in this movie. Yet this is one of the best Viking movies I think I've ever seen. Alexander Skarsgård does an amazing job playing this Viking character. It's something he's always wanted to do, and he waited for the right script. I think this might have been the one because it really is slick. Not only is all the Viking stuff great, but the look of this movie is amazing. The cinematography is fantastic, and it is based on Hamlet, or rather, Hamlet was based on an old Nordic folktale, and this is that folktale. But the themes carry through, and if you're the least bit familiar with the story of Hamlet, you're gonna pick up on all of that in The Northman. And if you're not, it's still a really excellent film, but it is fairly slow paced. You have to be pretty patient. I happen to think the payoff is worth it, especially if you're the least bit interested in just watching a really kind of brutal Viking movie. All right, my next pick is what I consider to be a highly underrated movie from 1974 that stars both Clint Eastwood and a very young Jeff Bridges in Thunderbolt and Lightfoot. So this too is actually a heist movie. It's about a couple of career criminals that do pull off multiple heists in this movie, and they do feel pretty grounded and realistic, even if one of them involves Jeff Bridges wearing a dress. But not only does this movie have great heist sequences, it's also got a very bizarre, almost psychedelic 1970s aesthetic at times, with a couple of weird scenes that seem really out of place, yet they help liven this thing up and make it feel like a product of the mid-70s. And then there's a couple of great car chases. Obviously Clint Eastwood's great, but the young Jeff Bridges really does stand out in this movie. If you've ever been a fan of his and you've never seen this movie, make it one of the first ones you watch off of this list, trust me. Okay, my number 13 pick is actually one of my favorite underrated Christmas movies to recommend here on the channel, and I don't see it available on streaming services every year, and that's Arthur Christmas. Now, this is obviously an animated movie for the family, but it's one of the better Christmas movies done in this style that I've ever seen. It's got a stunning visual style, but the interpretation of Santa, how his headquarters operate, how he's kind of passing the mantle down to one of his children, all of that stuff is really fantastic. And then the main characters end up going on this really epic adventure trying to deliver one lost present before the sun comes up. It's really fun stuff, and again, has this great visual style. And even though it's several years old, this really does hold up as a fantastic Christmas movie that you could watch with your kids year after year. All right, fans of the Twilight Zone are gonna definitely dig this next pick. It stars Christian Bale, and only about half of him because he weighed nearly 100 pounds when he filmed The Machinist. And his transformation from this body that you see here to the one that he had in Batman only took about 6 months and is one of the more legendary body transformations in movie history. And what's even more interesting about that is not only did he cut all of that weight for The Machinist, but there is a reason he looks like this in The Machinist, and it's the reason to watch this movie. It is a mystery, veiled in all sorts of gothic themes that are fantastic to watch, especially if you have an affinity for old Twilight Zone episodes. This obviously feels much more updated and has this brooding nature, but the structure of the story is very much like the Twilight Zone, and I absolutely love it for that. All right, now we're at my number 11 pick, and then we'll jump to the top 10. This being a pseudo-action flick, it is a little bit more of a detective story though. And speaking of detective stories, it's actually directed by Ridley Scott less than 10 years after he directed Blade Runner. And the reason I say that is because Black Rain does have a lot in common with Blade Runner, visually and thematically at least. Michael Douglas and Andy Garcia play a couple of New York cops that arrest a Yakuza member, and when he's extradited back to Japan, they go with him. So it's in Japan, so visually there's a lot of crossover with Blade Runner, but there's also a fish out of water element where these guys don't really understand Japanese culture, and it turns into a really fantastic neo-noir detective film that does have quite a few scenes of action that are pretty spectacular. I think Ridley Scott fans, this is a must-watch. If you've ever been a fan of Michael Douglas, this is a must-watch. If you loved Blade Runner, this is a must-watch. But I will say, even if you didn't get or connect with Blade Runner, this one is much more accessible and much more down-to-earth than a lot of Ridley Scott's other movies tend to be. Now, before moving on with the top 10 on this list, I do want to tell you about today's sponsor, AG1 by Athletic Greens, which is a product I've been consuming daily for almost a year now. But AG1 is an incredibly convenient powder that you mix into an 8-ounce glass of water, and it is absolutely packed with vitamins, minerals, probiotics, and adaptogens. And if you haven't caught on by now, yes, I literally watch movies for a living, which makes me a professional couch potato, and I need to stay active. And AG1 gives me all the benefits of a rich, leafy green diet, again, in a very convenient 8-ounce drink. And AG1 helps support a healthy immune system. And I don't know about you, but I want to have the most impervious immune system possible right now. But speaking of supporting your immune system, right now when you use my link in the description below, you're going to get a free gift that includes a year's supply of vitamin D3 and K2, which again will further support your immune system, and they're going to throw in some additional travel packs of AG1. But when you order, you get all of this stuff, the big bag of AG1, the nice metal container for storing it in the fridge, a great bottle to drink it out of, a nice metal scoop. Everything is top quality stuff. So again, if you want all the benefits of adding AG1 to your diet, go to my link in the description and you're going to get that free gift, including a year's supply of vitamin D3 and K2 and the travel packs. It's a fantastic deal. But speaking of fantastic stuff, let's move on with the top 10 movies on this list. So my next pick is another 2022 release, and this one will definitely make it into my top 10 movies of the year. There's no question. The Outfit.
You need to tell me what really happened in here tonight, now.
In this movie, Mark Rylance plays a tailor, and you should know that the entire movie takes place inside of his shop. Not only is he an excellent tailor, he also allows the mob to run business out the back of his shop, dropping off letters and whatnot. And one fateful night, he ends up sort of in a pressure cooker situation with some of these gangsters, and it ends up being a fantastic movie that, again, all takes place in basically one room. I think technically there are 3 in the movie. Most of it takes place in one room, and I was on the edge of my seat the entire time. Now, obviously, you've got fantastic actors making this thing work, but this is also from director Graham Noor, the director of The Imitation Game, which was also a fantastic movie. I think The Outfit being an even better display of his storytelling talents. Okay, my next pick just got added on November 3rd, and it's one of my favorite horror movies to have come out in the past 10 years or so, and that is Cabin in the Woods. In fact, this one's a little over 10 years old, so much so that Chris Hemsworth was not a big star back when this released. But man, does this movie still hold up. Obviously, it's having fun with the genre. There are a ton of movies that take place in a cabin out in the woods, not just The Evil Dead, even though this movie does reference that quite a bit, maybe more so than any other movie. But it does reference a ton of classic horror movies, and it does it with a tact that you rarely see. Not only is this a very interesting take on the genre all the way throughout, every single sequence is an interesting critique on the multitude of horror movies to have come out before this one. It also ends up being a wild ride that goes way over the top in literally the best way possible. So not only are there great horror elements, there's a lot of fantastic comedy elements in this as well, without it ever quite becoming a horror comedy. But a comedy for the whole family that is kind of a horror movie for the main characters at least is Mouse Hunt. Now, even if you've seen this, I guarantee you this is well worth rewatching, even if you don't have kids. This is directed by Gore Verbinski, who would go on to do Pirates of the Caribbean and a whole bunch of fantastic movies. Visually, I think Mouse Hunt is still one of his greatest filmmaking endeavors. Every shot in this movie looks authentic. When they're using CGI, you can barely tell, and it makes for an amazing watch. Not only are the performances great with people like Nathan Lane and Christopher Walken in a really fun role, but the camera work in Mouse Hunt is top notch. Not just because you're following a mouse through all these mouse holes, but because all of that and all the production design works together seamlessly. This is a visually stunning movie with every single little crumb and cobweb in this house all looks fantastic. I love watching this film, again, with or without kids. But if that's not for you and you need something with some real hard edges, my next pick is probably the most famous movie on this particular list, Face Off.
His face.
Now, if you're to watch this today, there is quite a bit of cheesiness in it. This is directed by John Woo, who was a maestro in his era, but his style of filmmaking became so copied, it does feel a bit cheesy today. However, his use of doves and all of that is still really slick on screen. And even though Nicolas Cage is kind of chewing the scenery up in this one, it is a marvel to watch. I mean, yes, he's overplaying his hand like he often does, but it's still thoroughly entertaining. And let's not forget, the action in this movie was top-notch back when this came out. Now, they do film action a lot better today than they used to, but still, Face Off is a wild, fun ride that holds up in a nostalgic sense, if nothing else. Now, a much more grounded courtroom drama from the same era as Face Off is Primal Fear. This is easily one of my favorite Richard Gere movies, and it's got a fantastic early role from Edward Norton. This movie is famous for multiple twists, so I'm obviously not going to spoil any of that here, but Edward Norton plays a young man who is accused of murder, and Richard Gere is a high-powered lawyer that's taking on his case. And what's so great about Primal Fear is you do get to see some of the manipulation that goes on behind the scenes in cases like this. The way lawyers work with their clients, all of that's fantastic. And again, Edward Norton, he's young in this, but he's delivering just an incredible performance that drives this thing forward and makes it work. Don't get me wrong, Richard Gere's great, but Edward Norton really is the fuel on the fire in this movie. If you've never seen it, it definitely holds up and is a fantastic watch. I highly recommend it. But even if you have and you know the twists, this is still a solid courtroom drama. Now, if you're to think about some of the most famous movie stars working today, Tom Hanks would certainly come to mind. But one of his most beautiful movies, and I also consider to be one of his most underrated or at least underappreciated today, is Road to Perdition. Now, this is from director Sam Mendes, who also did American Beauty, would go on to do Jarhead, Skyfall, and most recently, 1917. And Road to Perdition is still one of my favorite films of his. This movie revolves around the mob in the 1930s. It is one of Paul Newman's final performances, and it is an incredible one from him. You also get a really great role from Daniel Craig before he was very famous. Jude Law is an absolute maniac in this movie, and it is a stunning film. There are multiple sequences that are just fantastically written, but they're also shot in this beautiful style. The movie looks incredible. This is one that is so much more rewatchable than I think people give it credit for. For some reason, this one has just not been maintained as a highly rewatchable movie, even though it most certainly is. Okay, so Ridley Scott was on this list once. He's actually going to make an appearance before I get to my number one pick, but his brother, the late Tony Scott, also makes this list with one of my favorite films of his, Man on Fire.
C4, highly explosive. That's what you have in your ass right now. Don't move, don't move, don't move.
Now keep in mind, I said this is one of my favorites of his, and we're talking about Tony Scott, the director of the original Top Gun, Crimson Tide, and True Romance. I still think Man on Fire is one of the best revenge films of its kind, and I am a big proponent of revenge films. I mean, obviously Denzel Washington's performance makes the movie good. Like, that goes without saying in almost anything that he's in, but Tony Scott's really frenetic style of filmmaking, at least the style that he would come to adopt before he died, suits this story so well. I absolutely love the mood and vibe of Man on Fire. It's well written, it's well acted, but again, the Tony Scott energy that he's able to bring to his movies, again, especially his later films, is on full display in Man on Fire. Man on Fire holds up because it's so well structured and put together, and again, that style helps elevate something that was already pretty fantastic. Okay, there have been some dark movies on this list, but very few movies are as dark as my next pick, Jacob's Ladder. This is one of the most mind-bending movies ever made, and what's so incredible about it is when you watch it, there are tons of visual effects in this movie, and they're all understated, they're all subtle, but they're in almost every sequence. This is an incredibly stunning movie, even if most of the sequences are quite dark. In this movie, Tim Robbins plays a postman who begins to see things just out the corner of his eye. Somebody looks like they might have a tail, somebody looks like they might have a horn, things like that, and he begins to feel like he's being visited by demons. So again, this goes in a very, very dark direction. But again, it's beautifully shot. So this one has an incredible story and again, a just top-notch reveal. But beyond that, you also get some amazing practical effects that are really worked in without showing them off too much, and it just heightens the mood of this thing and makes Jacob's Ladder work so well. There is a remake that came out just a few years ago, but the original from 1990 is one of the most underrated movies of its kind I've ever seen. Okay, my number two pick on this list is also from Ridley Scott, and there are two versions on Prime Video. There's the regular theatrical version that probably just goes by the name Kingdom of Heaven, and then there is the director's cut or the roadshow cut, which is almost an hour longer. Now, this movie kind of flopped when it came out. It probably made a bunch of money opening weekend, but was not well received by fans or by critics. And this was Ridley Scott's first epic historical drama following the success of Gladiator, so there was a lot of anticipation, and for some reason the movie just didn't hit on all cylinders when it came out in theaters. We would find out later that the studio cut major portions of it for time and essentially ruined the movie. However, the extended cut is over 3 hours long. It features an intermission and is almost an hour longer with a ton of scenes omitted from the theatrical release that make this movie work so much better. So I highly recommend the director's cut, not the original cut. Do not go with the other cut because you don't have 3 hours to spend. You're going to be disappointed in the movie. Watch it in 2 parts if you have to. This is an amazing movie that was famously ruined by the studios, but luckily it wasn't ruined forever and we can watch the director's cut. It has been a while since I've seen it available on streaming, so I will be revisiting this one very soon. And then my number one pick is one of the most widely beloved movies of all time, despite it having some really rough edges, including one of Gary Oldman's most villainous performances of all time, Leon the Professional. And talk about movies that hold up. This movie features nothing that studios seem to think is so important. You've got a weird performance from Jean Reno, yet it works incredibly well. It endears the audience to him so well. You've got this also strange performance from a young Natalie Portman, and there's a weird mix and dynamic. And then Gary Oldman, even though he's playing a New York City cop, he's this incredibly maniacal, almost mustache twisting type of guy, which on paper doesn't sound like it would work. It sounds cheesy, but my goodness, does he play the shit out of this character. I absolutely love watching him play this villain. This movie looks great. The action pops off in an unbelievable way when it wants to, and then the more subtle moments are also wildly entertaining. The movie starts off with a bang. I mean, my goodness, like, there's a reason this movie has held up. If somehow you're watching this video and you've never seen The Professional, make it the first thing you watch after watching this video. However, if it's been a while since you've seen The Professional, I promise you it holds up better than you would imagine. But that is the list. Thanks again to Athletic Greens for sponsoring another video, and I will keep making these videos as long as you keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this special Prime Video episode, and you will see me on the next one.